Political commentary, breaking down the French president's speech on Palestine recognition, ceasefire, and Hamas demilitarization. Introduction. On a significant day in global politics, the fictional French president delivered a landmark speech announcing France's decision to formally recognize the state of Palestine, alongside urgent calls for an immediate ceasefire in the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict and the demilitarization of Hamas. This speech, set to be formalized at the United Nations General Assembly in September 2025, marks a bold shift in France's foreign policy and has sparked intense debate across the international community. The announcement comes at a time of heightened tensions in the Middle East, with ceasefire negotiations faltering and humanitarian crises deepening in Gaza. This commentary dissects the key points of the president's speech, analyzes their implications for France, the Middle East, and the global stage, and evaluates the potential consequences of these policy positions. The speech's core elements, recognition of Palestine, a call for an immediate ceasefire, and the demand for Hamas's demilitarization, carry profound implications for diplomacy, security, and humanitarian efforts. By recognizing Palestine, France positions itself as a leader among Western nations in advocating for a two-state solution. The call for a ceasefire addresses the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, while the push for Hamas's demilitarization reflects a pragmatic acknowledgement of security concerns for both Israel and a future Palestinian state. This article will explore each of these points in depth, examining their historical context, immediate impacts, and long-term consequences, while also considering the domestic and international reactions to this bold policy shift. Recognition of the State of Palestine. Context and announcement. The French president's announcement that France will formally recognize the State of Palestine at the UN General Assembly in September 2025 is a historic milestone. This decision positions France as the first G7 nation to take such a step, joining over 140 countries, including Spain, Ireland, Norway, and Slovenia, that have already recognized Palestine. The president framed this move as part of France's historic commitment to a just and lasting peace in the Middle East, emphasizing the need to build a viable Palestinian state that recognizes Israel and contributes to regional security. The recognition of Palestine has been a contentious issue in international politics for decades. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, rooted in competing claims to the same territory since the late 19th century, has seen numerous failed peace processes, including the Oslo Accords of the 1990s. France's decision comes amid growing global frustration with Israel's policies, particularly its restrictions on humanitarian aid to Gaza and ongoing settlement expansion in the West Bank, which the International Court of Justice has deemed illegal. The president's speech reflects a broader European shift toward acknowledging Palestinian statehood as a prerequisite for a two-state solution, especially as the humanitarian crisis in Gaza worsens. Implications for France. France's recognition of Palestine carries significant domestic and international implications. Domestically, the decision is likely to resonate with France's large Muslim population and progressive political factions, who have long advocated for Palestinian rights. However, it may also provoke backlash from pro-Israel groups and conservative elements within France, who could argue that the move undermines Israel's security. The president's speech carefully balanced this by emphasizing that a Palestinian state must recognize Israel and accept demilitarization, aiming to mitigate criticism from those who fear that recognition rewards militancy. Internationally, France's move could galvanize other Western nations, particularly the United Kingdom, to follow suit. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, facing pressure from his own Labour Party, has signaled openness to recognizing Palestine, describing statehood as an inalienable right of the Palestinian people. France's leadership may create a domino effect, potentially isolating the United States, which has historically opposed unilateral recognition of Palestine. The U.S. State Department, through Secretary of State Marco Rubio, labeled the decision reckless, arguing that it could embolden Hamas and destabilize the region. This divergence highlights a growing transatlantic divide on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Implications for the Middle East. In the Middle East, France's recognition of Palestine is a diplomatic earthquake. For Palestinians, it is a significant victory, validating their quest for self-determination. The Palestinian Authority, PA, led by President Mahmoud Abbas, welcomed the decision, with Abbas's deputy, Hussein al-Sheikh, praising France's commitment to international law. However, the recognition also raises questions about the governance structure of a future Palestinian state. The PA, currently in its 20th year of what was meant to be a 4-year term, faces legitimacy challenges, and Hamas's control of Gaza complicates the path to unified governance. For Israel, the announcement has been met with fierce condemnation. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu described it as a reward for terror, referencing Hamas's October 7, 2023, attack that killed approximately 1,200 Israelis. Israel fears that recognizing Palestine without resolving security concerns could create a launch pad for further attacks, particularly if Hamas retains influence. The president's call for Hamas's demilitarization addresses this concern, but Israel remains skeptical, viewing France's move as undermining its security. Regionally, the decision has been praised by countries like Saudi Arabia, which called it a historic decision, and Ireland, which sees it as advancing the two-state solution. However, it may strain France's relations with Israel and the United States, potentially complicating cooperation on other regional issues, such as counterterrorism and Iran's nuclear ambitions. The upcoming France-Saudi Arabia conference on the two-state solution, scheduled for September 2025, will be a critical test of whether France can translate its recognition into concrete diplomatic progress. Long-term consequences. The long-term implications of France's recognition depend on its ability to catalyze broader international support for a two-state solution. By formalizing recognition at the UN, France aims to elevate Palestine's status to that of a non-member observer state, similar to its current UN status, but with greater diplomatic weight. This could enhance Palestine's ability to pursue legal action against Israel at international bodies like the International Criminal Court, further escalating tensions. However, recognition alone does not address the practical challenges of statehood, such as territorial contiguity, economic viability, and governance. The West Bank remains fragmented by Israeli settlements, and Gaza's infrastructure lies in ruins after nearly 2 years of conflict. France's commitment to rebuilding Gaza, as outlined in the speech, is a step toward addressing these challenges, but it requires significant financial and political investment from the international community. Call for an immediate ceasefire. Context and announcement. The French president's call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza responds to the dire humanitarian situation in the region. Since the escalation of the Israel-Hamas conflict on October 7, 2023, Gaza has faced relentless bombardment, with over 54,000 Palestinians killed, according to the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry, and more than 2 million displaced. The president highlighted the unspeakable and indefensible suffering in Gaza, echoing warnings from over 100 humanitarian organizations about mass starvation due to Israel's restrictions on aid. Ceasefire negotiations, mediated by Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, have repeatedly stalled. The most recent talks collapsed in July 2025, with U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff accusing Hamas of lacking a desire to reach a ceasefire. Hamas, in turn, criticized Israel for imposing unacceptable conditions, such as maintaining military presence in Gaza and relying on the controversial Gaza Humanitarian Foundation for aid distribution. The president's call for a ceasefire aligns with international demands, including from the UN and European allies, for an end to hostilities and the restoration of humanitarian aid flows. Implications for France. By prioritizing a ceasefire, France positions itself as a moral leader in the international community, advocating for humanitarian principles amid a crisis that has drawn global condemnation. This stance aligns with France's historical role as a mediator in Middle Eastern conflicts and enhances its diplomatic influence. However, it also risks straining relations with Israel, which views military operations in Gaza as essential to neutralizing Hamas. France's condemnation of Israel's aid blockade, as articulated in the speech, further complicates this relationship. Domestically, the ceasefire call is likely to garner broad support from French citizens, particularly given widespread media coverage of Gaza's humanitarian crisis. However, it may face criticism from those who argue that a ceasefire without Hamas's disarmament could allow the group to regroup and launch future attacks. The president's inclusion of Hamas demilitarization in the speech aims to address this concern, but implementing such a ceasefire remains a complex challenge. Implications for the Middle East. A ceasefire would provide immediate relief to Gaza's population, allowing humanitarian aid to reach those in need. The World Health Organization has reported that 900,000 children in Gaza are facing hunger, with 70,000 showing signs of malnutrition. The UN has thousands of aid trucks waiting at the border, unable to enter due to Israel's restrictions. A ceasefire could facilitate the distribution of food, water, and medical supplies, potentially averting a deeper humanitarian catastrophe. For Israel, a ceasefire could secure the release of hostages still held by Hamas, estimated at 20 living and 30 deceased. Previous proposals, such as the US-sponsored 60-day truce, called for the release of 10 living hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. However, disagreements over aid distribution and Israeli troop withdrawals have stalled progress. Hamas insists on UN-led aid distribution and a complete Israeli withdrawal, while Israel prioritizes maintaining control over parts of Gaza to prevent Hamas from rearming. Regionally, a ceasefire could de-escalate tensions, particularly after recent clashes between Israel and Iran. However, without a permanent resolution, it risks being a temporary pause, as seen in the failed January 2025 ceasefire. The president's speech emphasizes the need for a ceasefire to pave the way for a two-state solution, but achieving this requires overcoming deep mistrust between Israel and Hamas. Long-term consequences. A successful ceasefire could lay the groundwork for renewed peace talks, potentially under the auspices of the France-Saudi Arabia Conference. However, the collapse of previous negotiations highlights the difficulty of securing a lasting truce. Hamas's insistence on a permanent end to the war and Israel's demand for Hamas's disarmament remain major sticking points. France's role as a mediator could be pivotal, but it will require navigating these competing demands while maintaining credibility with both parties. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza underscores the urgency of a ceasefire. Without immediate action, the death toll and suffering will continue to rise, further eroding international support for Israel and increasing pressure for unilateral actions like Palestine's recognition. France's call for massive humanitarian aid aligns with the UN's demands, but implementing this requires Israel's cooperation, which is uncertain given the current political climate. Push for Hamas demilitarization. Context and announcement. The French president's demand for the demilitarization of Hamas is a critical component of the speech, reflecting a pragmatic approach to balancing Palestinian statehood with Israel's security concerns. Hamas, designated a terrorist organization by the US, EU, and others, has controlled Gaza since 2006 and led the October 7, 2023, attack on Israel. The president argued that a demilitarized Hamas is essential for a viable Palestinian state that recognizes Israel and contributes to regional security. Demilitarization is a contentious issue. Hamas has rejected proposals that require it to disarm, viewing its military capabilities as a defense against Israeli occupation. Israel, meanwhile, insists that Hamas's disarmament is non-negotiable, citing the group's history of attacks. The president's speech acknowledges this complexity, framing demilitarization as a condition for peace and stability, alongside the release of hostages and Gaza's reconstruction. Implications for France. By calling for Hamas's demilitarization, France aligns with Western allies like the US and Israel, who view the group as a primary obstacle to peace. This stance helps mitigate accusations that France's recognition of Palestine rewards terrorism, a charge leveled by Israeli leaders and U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham. However, it risks alienating Palestinian factions and their supporters, who see Hamas as a legitimate resistance movement. The president's careful wording, emphasizing a demilitarized Palestine that recognizes Israel, seeks to bridge this divide. Domestically, the demilitarization call may face criticism from French leftists and pro-Palestinian groups, who argue that it unfairly targets Palestinian armed groups while ignoring Israel's military dominance. France's adoption of sanctions against Israeli settlers in the West Bank, as mentioned in prior statements, may help balance this perception, but the issue remains divisive. Implications for the Middle East. Hamas's demilitarization is a prerequisite for Israel's acceptance of a Palestinian state, but it is a non-starter for Hamas itself. The group has consistently demanded a permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal as conditions for any agreement. The president's speech sidesteps the question of how demilitarization would be enforced, a critical gap given Hamas's entrenched control of Gaza and its access to weapons through smuggling networks. For Palestinians, demilitarization raises concerns about sovereignty and security. A demilitarized state could leave Palestine vulnerable to Israeli military actions, particularly given Israel's control over the West Bank and its history of incursions. The PA, which lacks a military, has limited influence in Gaza, and any demilitarization process would require its strengthening, as France has advocated. Regionally, the call for demilitarization aligns with the interests of countries like Saudi Arabia, which have conditioned normalization with Israel on progress toward a two-state solution. However, it may complicate ceasefire negotiations, as Hamas is unlikely to agree to disarmament without significant concessions, such as a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Long-term consequences. The demilitarization of Hamas is a long-term goal that requires a fundamental restructuring of Gaza's governance. The PA's return to Gaza, as envisioned by France, would necessitate significant reforms to address its legitimacy crisis and counter Hamas's influence. International oversight, possibly through the UN, could play a role in enforcing demilitarization, but this would require Hamas's cooperation or its political neutralization, both of which are challenging. The broader implication is the potential transformation of Hamas from a militant group to a political entity, similar to the evolution of the Palestine Liberation Organization in the 1990s. However, Hamas's ideology and history make this unlikely without external pressure, such as economic incentives or sanctions. France's role in co-chairing the two-state solution conference with Saudi Arabia could provide a platform for exploring these options, but success hinges on bridging the gap between Israeli and Palestinian demands. Broader geopolitical context. Historical background. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, dating back to the late 19th century, centers on competing national aspirations over the same territory. The 1948 establishment of Israel, the 1967 Six-Day War, and subsequent occupations of the West Bank and Gaza have shaped the modern conflict. The Oslo Accords of 1993 and 1995 aimed to create a framework for Palestinian self-governance, but the process stalled due to settlement expansion, violence, and mutual distrust. The October 7, 2023, Hamas attack and Israel's subsequent military campaign in Gaza marked a new escalation, with unprecedented casualties and destruction. The failure of multiple ceasefire attempts, including the January 2025 truce, has deepened the humanitarian crisis and eroded international patience with the status quo. France's speech reflects this frustration, positioning recognition of Palestine as a step toward breaking the cycle of violence. International reactions. The international response to France's announcement has been polarized. Palestinian officials, including Mahmoud Abbas, have hailed it as a step toward justice, while Hamas called it a positive step, but stopped short of endorsing demilitarization. Israel's government, led by Netanyahu, has condemned the move, arguing that it rewards terrorism and threatens Israel's existence. The U.S., Israel's closest ally, has opposed the decision, with envoy Steve Witkoff warning of regional instability. European allies like the UK, Germany, and Ireland have expressed cautious support, emphasizing the need for a ceasefire and a two-state solution. Saudi Arabia's endorsement reflects its interest in linking normalization with Israel to Palestinian statehood. The UN, through its calls for humanitarian access, aligns with France's ceasefire demands, but its limited enforcement power constrains its impact. Domestic French politics. In France, the president's speech is a high-stakes gamble. The decision to recognize Palestine appeals to progressive voters and France's Muslim community, but it risks alienating pro-Israel groups and fueling far-right criticism. The National Rally, led by Marine Le Pen, may seize on the issue to portray the president as soft on terrorism, particularly given the emphasis on Hamas's demilitarization. However, the president's broader vision of a peaceful Middle East could resonate with a public weary of endless conflict. Challenges and opportunities. Challenges. Implementation of recognition. Recognizing Palestine is symbolic without concrete steps to establish its viability. Territorial disputes, governance issues, and economic challenges must be addressed, requiring international cooperation. Ceasefire negotiations. The collapse of recent talks highlights the difficulty of securing a truce. Hamas's refusal to disarm and Israel's insistence on maintaining control over Gaza are major obstacles. Hamas demilitarization. Enforcing demilitarization requires Hamas's cooperation or its political marginalization, both of which are unlikely without significant concessions. Israeli opposition. Israel's strong opposition to Palestinian statehood, coupled with its military dominance, could undermine France's efforts. U.S. resistance. The U.S.'s rejection of unilateral recognition complicates France's leadership, potentially isolating it within the G7. Opportunities. Diplomatic leadership. France's role as a mediator, reinforced by the France-Saudi Arabia Conference, positions it as a leader in Middle East peace efforts. European momentum. France's recognition could encourage other European nations to follow, strengthening the EU's collective stance on the two-state solution. Humanitarian relief. A successful ceasefire could alleviate Gaza's crisis, restoring France's credibility as a humanitarian advocate. Regional normalization. Linking Palestinian statehood to Saudi-Israeli normalization could reshape Middle Eastern alliances, with France as a key player. Conclusion. The French president's speech represents a bold and risky step toward reshaping the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. By recognizing Palestine, calling for a ceasefire, and demanding Hamas's demilitarization, France seeks to break the deadlock that has plagued the region for decades. The implications are far-reaching, affecting France's domestic politics, its international standing, and the Middle East's fragile balance of power. While the recognition of Palestine signals a calm,